So now for tonight's program, we've got Leonard Volk. I'm sure a lot of you know him. His family's been in Dallas since 1887. Leonard's a retired architect, renowned photographer. We actually have part of the Volk family collection here, so I think you saw some of the pieces outside. But he's also got his daughter Alison here, so I want to introduce the two of them to come out, and they'll give a little talk about the Volk family.
Okay, hello everyone. Thank you for being here this evening. Thank you to the Dallas Historical Society for having us and having all these wonderful archives that we get to speak about this evening. A special thank you to Carl and to Molly Nolan and to all of the staff here because they were so great about pulling all these amazing treasures from the archives and helping us put together the presentation this evening. So when they asked my father to speak, tonight, we thought of all these different topics that we could cover, and there were a lot. So there's his family's history, the Volk estates, Volk Brothers department stores, my grandfather's history in World War I and World War II, my dad's history in World War II, my dad's architecture career, his community service career of 35 years, and of course his photography. So with that being said, we kind of went through and put together an overview and a lot of different things, but there is a written script to keep us somewhat in line. And he also said that I could interrupt him if need be. So just FYI. Okay. So Dad, my first question is, why don't you start by telling us how your grandfather came to Dallas in the first place?
Thanks.
You're welcome.
And I would like to thank everyone, each one of you, for coming tonight. I appreciate it very much. My grandfather, who was Leonard W. Volk, I was named for him, of course, Leonard William Volk. He came here. Well, let me put it this way: he came here from Baltimore. And the Volks had a shoe and leather store in Baltimore, but there were too many sons for them all to work there. So my grandfather went to Monterrey, Mexico, because he had gone to school with someone who was from Monterrey to see if he wanted to live there. Well, he decided not to. But he was an elegant guy, about 20 or 21 years old at the time. And he came back to Dallas because his older brother, George, had moved to Dallas in 1887. But when he came back from Monterey, he had a black velvet charro suit trimmed in silver and a great big sombrero. He was kind of an elegant guy anyway. I never have figured out really quite why the Volk brothers decided to settle in Dallas, because it at that time was kind of a tough frontier town of 20 or 30,000 people, where my grandfather had a story he liked to tell about when he was here, seeing some guy get thrown out of the second story window of a saloon. It was at that time still a destination for cattle drives, and it was a tough place. But anyway, Granddaddy went to work for a shoe store on Elm Street in 1889. And in 1890, he bought the store and started Volk Brothers Company with his older brother George as its first president. Well, they did well and enlarged the store, and they moved to other locations still on Elm Street. And in 1929 and 30, they built the main downtown Volk Brothers store and changed the nature of a business from a shoe store to a specialty store. It was a 6-story building. Let's see, can we maybe see some of those?
Yeah, I think we can. In the meantime, really quick, Dad, tell us, when they moved to Dallas, how did Brookside become Volk Estates?
Oh,
Touch on that for a little bit,
okay.
and then we'll find that photo.
Oh, all right. Well, in about 1926 or 7, Granddaddy bought some vacant land in University Park, bounded on the north by Lover's Lane, on the east and south by Turtle Creek, on the west by the creek west of Vassar Drive. And the name of the subdivision was Brookside. Granddaddy put my father, Harold Volk, in charge of making a subdivision out of it. So he had a subdivision plan made and installed the streets and utilities. And then in the depths of the Depression, like from 29 to 34, he sold every single lot in the whole subdivision except one that he allowed a broker. And this was in spite of the fact that he was offering double commissions for anybody who could sell, but he sold them all. Granddaddy built the first house in Brookside, which of course now everybody calls Volk Estates. He built the first house on Turtle Creek Boulevard. It is the plaster and timber Tudor house, which still looks the way it did when we used to spend Sunday lunches with my grandparents when we were little kids, when Florence and I were little. And Grandmama Volk made the most delicious homemade root beer that was such a treat that we looked forward all the time. And my granddaddy smoked cigars, and he kept his fresh stock in the coat closet by the front entrance, and it really smelled good. You know, it really smelled good. However, the draperies in the house smelled of cigar smoke, and that was not as good. So anyway, Granddaddy was a golfer, and he had a putting green between the house and Turtle Creek.
And then, okay, and so then George Dahl designed the main Elm Street store. That's kind of where you were saying after, the first store after a few moves on Elm Street, then George Dahl came in. And tell us about that design.
Well, the main Volk store at 1806, 8, and 10 Elm Street was designed by George Dahl, who of course was really an outstanding architect. And it had a very inviting canopy that extended over the sidewalk, over the main entrance, a separate smaller entrance to the men's suite apartment, and show windows. And there were 5 sales floors, the green room in the basement, and then floors 1 through 4 were a variety of departments, like women's and girls' shoes, women's and girls' clothing and furs. And each one of the floors had a very large space, grand, that was appropriate and inviting and had a good quality feel to it. So it was an outstanding building. The fifth floor was all management. It was all management and sample rooms for merchandise. It was where marketing occurred. The sixth floor designed and made women's hats, surprisingly. Should I tell about the police department? And
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I think you can talk about the lease department.
Well, it's like this changed the concept for the business from a shoe store to a retail specialty store. The Volk department, the shoes were usually about 40% well, let's see. Yeah.
Well, Dad, what about the Highland Park store? What happened when your dad decided that he wanted to start the first suburban retail store in Dallas?
Oh, okay. Well, in 1935, my father, Harold Volk, decided to build the first suburban store by any downtown merchant. And all of his merchant friends really gave him a hard time about that. They said, you're just crazy to do that. All you're going to do is take sales away from your downtown store. Well, he went ahead with it, and it was so successful that Highland Park Village store set national records for sales per square foot and was enlarged twice in the 30s.
And that's a picture right there of the Highland Park store,
yeah.
Right, Dad? So if you're at
That's
Starbucks
right. Yes,
and
that's
you're looking out, that's the entire side that goes along Mockingbird, right, Daddy?
Well, no, this is internal, the internal side.
Right,
This is
but it's
not
on that,
Mockingbird,
right?
not the
but it's
Mockingbird side.
Backs up to Mockingbird.
It's in the north side building, but it is this is taken from the parking side. In 1949, Dad built the second suburban store by a downtown retailer at Skillman and Live Oak. And the third store was Neiman's store that was built in 1950 in Preston Center. So Dad was the one who opened the door and convinced downtown retailers that this was a good thing.
That is true. And Daddy, how many Volk stores were there in total?
They were 8 altogether in Dallas. There was a lease department also in Fort Worth and another lease department in Waco. But the other stores in Dallas were like Wynwood and Big Town and Preston Royal. Oh gosh,
There were 8 in total, right?
There were 8 altogether.
And then what were some? Because I called my grandfather Big Daddy. That he had some pretty cool things in the stores, like really fun features, right?
Well, it's like the Live Oak store had a smile maker in its it had a monkey in a glass enclosure from Brazil, and also Wynwood had that kind of feature, and the Live Oak store had a goldfish pond, a koi pond with water lilies and so on at the main entrance to the store. Also at the Live Oak store, there was a meeting room which was reserved entirely for neighborhood organizations to use, that which was popular. And also there was the custom that the Live Oak store would have a giant, well-decorated Christmas tree and a whole lot of presents for kids. And they would the presents would be given out by local heroes like Doak Walker and Kyle Rote. And my father thoroughly enjoyed taking part in events like that. The downtown store had a funny thing. It was a fluoroscope, so kids could climb onto this onto the fluoroscope and see the bones in their feet in all shades of green, and they got a big kick out of that.
I want that and a monkey
You like the monkey
for Christmas.
Yeah.
And then tell us about your father's relationship with Nordstrom and what that was about.
Oh, well, my father created an organization whose members were 50 of the most outstanding shoe stores throughout the country. Nordstrom was one of them. My father persuaded the Nordstrom brothers to expand their business from just shoes by adding apparel. They did that. And that's when they became so successful that they started going national.
That what would you say that the Volk stores meant to your father?
Oh, it was a continuing joy and inspiration to my dad. He was fascinated by the whole thing. He liked even the nitty-gritty stuff of setting sales goals and meeting or beating them, of competition, of selecting beautiful things that people would really enjoy. He loved going to shoe shows, for example, and he invented a line of shoes called British Walkers, and arranged for a good manufacturer to produce them that had special character, and that was very successful. Both men's and women's shoes, British Walkers. He also enjoyed the interactions with staff. Like there were normally about 400 employees, and many of them had worked at Volks for years and were personal friends as well as employees. I think he got a big kick every day going to work and greeting his team members. He was a very gregarious person, lots of friends.
Okay, I'm going to throw you a curveball because I didn't ask you this before. This is not in the script. What is your favorite memory of the Volk stores? And I know you worked there, so was it when you worked there, or was it your childhood, or give us that memory?
Well, I only worked at Volks for a couple of years, and I worked on things like selling men's shoes and furnishings, men's furnishings, and devising a stock numbering system for all the shoe departments, which was a complicated matter because we had Volks had the biggest selection, and the longest size runs of anybody. We were, let's say, Volk Brothers was the biggest retailer, shoe retailer, in the whole South and Southwest. People would come from Mexico to shop at Volks specifically for shoes because they would have selections, styles, and size runs that couldn't be found elsewhere. He even enjoyed the uncertainties of the competition, like fighting off the competition for choice product lines, whether it was shoes or other things.
So basically, your favorite memory was the monkeys.
Well,
We got segued. Did you have a personal favorite part of the store, Dad?
not really. No, not really.
All right. And the stores were around for 80 years. And then when did they close?
Well, I should explain that in 1930, Dad brought in a lease department to run the women's and girls' clothing and furs part of the business. And it's like, for many years, that lease department, Goldring, headquarters in New York, produced about a third of the profits, and 2/3 were Volk departments. And unfortunately, Milton Weiss, who was the head of the lease department at Volks, was killed in a plane crash going hunting with Tom Braniff, the head of Braniff Airways. And from that time on, the Goldring Lease Department lost money. And it was a continuing problem for my dad to try to get better management in the Goldring Lease Department. And it was made more complicated by the fact that as we opened suburban stores, we had to we needed for Goldring to go along with us. So where you open a half a dozen stores over a period of years, they needed to come along, be part of it. Well, my father retired I don't remember exactly when, but I think it was mid-60s. And in the years after he left leadership, the lease department problem became rapidly worse, to the point that finally the company was sold to Culver's in 1970. And my dad died in 79. And George Dahl's fine building, which had been named as a national treasure, was demolished in 1980 without warning. Even though I was a photographer, I kind of had a block on. I never photographed Volk buildings, even the downtown store, because for me they were permanent, and I didn't have to save that memory because they would always be there. But unfortunately, it came down.
Very sad. good to note, though, for nothing's permanent, right? Well, your dad permanently had exceptional taste in fashion and in lifestyle. And you lived in some really cool places growing up in Dallas. So tell us about your childhood and where you lived in Dallas and what it was like back then. Because you were born in 1928, right?
That's right. Well, we lived on Golf Drive in Brookside, or Volk Estates anyway. In the second house, Granddaddy's was the first house that was built in Brookside, and Dad and Mother's house was the second one built on Golf Drive. And Florence Adele, my older sister, and I were little kids on golf, and it was Mother and Dad were our role models. We loved them, and they loved us, and they made a wonderful home for Florence and me. There were kids to play with in the neighborhood. We were close to an elementary school and a park, and we lived in a house full of art and books, and we're really happy there. And I think that we, my parents sold that house because in the Depression, because we couldn't afford it. That's just my guess. They didn't say anything about it. They didn't tell us kids why. But then we lived in rented place on Westway, upstairs of a duplex, and a rented house on St. John's Drive, and then, surprisingly, we lived in an apartment on the second floor of the Dallas Country Club building. Not the present one, the first one. And believe me, that was a kid's paradise. Because I mean, here this clubhouse was a huge building with a great big ballroom and open air porches and stuff, and it was a great place to explore. And Florence and I had the run of the place.
Why didn't you raise
And
me
it's
there?
It's like Clarence Pangborn, who was the manager, even tried smoking grapevine there.
What my client meant to say. Swung from the grapevine.
Yeah.
And then you guys moved back.
Well, then what happened was that in about 58, my parents asked O'Neill Ford to design a house for them to build on Vassar Drive in Brookside. Unfortunately, I never saw the plans, and it wasn't built because the bids came in twice the budget. So as it happened, the house that they built at 7000 Vassar was designed by Gaydon Thompson, and in
1940?
what?
In 1940?
Yeah.
In 1940, it was selected
and it was selected as by the wives of Dallas architects as the best contemporary house of that year.
That's pretty cool. Okay, and now let's talk about a little bit back to your dad. So he went to school in Dallas, and then Andover, and then Yale, and you took a similar path too, right?
Yes. Dad graduated from Terrell Preparatory School. And he knew that he couldn't get into, he really wanted to go to Yale, but he knew he couldn't get in there coming from Terrell Prep, a tiny little Dallas school. So he spent a year at Phillips Academy in Andover, Massachusetts. And then he got admitted to the class of 1917 at Yale. He was my hero and my role model and everything. I wanted to do, I wanted to be like my dad. So I went to Terrell School also, and I had this, surprisingly enough, the same teacher that had taught him, Mrs. H.D. Taylor, a wonderful teacher. When I was in Terrell School, her classroom was the living room of a tiny little old white painted house with 3 classes in the living room that she would hear recite in sequence. And I remember being pleased and proud when Miss Taylor told me that I was the best pupil she ever had.
Like father, like daughter.
Well, anyway, and then I followed my dad to Andover and to Yale.
And Dad, after your dad left Yale, then he went into World War I. Why don't you tell them a little bit about that experience?
Dad was in ROTC at Yale, and in 1917, he left before graduation to join the war effort. He left to go to the first officers training camp at Leon Springs, Texas. Yale granted diplomas. They graduated all of the people who left to serve their country before graduation. And the Leon Springs group of people turned out to be leaders all over Texas for years thereafter, and they kept up with each other because they had annual reunions of the first officers training camp.
And then after World War I, your dad came back to Dallas and became president of Volk Brothers. And during World War II, he was determined to help with the war effort. So tell us a little bit about how he announced the shoe ration and stuff in World War II.
Well, during World War II, Dad was the president of the National Shoe Retailers Association and worked with the National War Production Board to devise shoe rationing for the nation, which Dad announced to he worked it out and announced it to the country on the radio. He had kept up with his military contacts through the years and wrote scores of letters trying to get into the war effort. And he finally succeeded, went through the tests for the Office of Special Services, the OSS, which were so demanding and so detailed that they had written a big fat book called Assessment of Men. Well, he managed to pass all of this and went into the OSS as a civilian with an equivalent rank of full colonel and was assigned to duty in London in 1944 during the buzz bomb blitz. He told me about going up on the roof of the Dorchester Hotel to watch the buzz bombs come across, accompanied by friends of his from Dallas who were in the oil business and were there to ensure a supply of petroleum products for the war effort. And they would watch from the roof at night, searchlights back and forth, buzz bombs that they could see, flak everywhere, trying to shoot them down. This was in the early days before the Brits realized that it was wiser to let them fall in the countryside than in London. He was there to create a psychological warfare unit. He carried a card that was signed by Dwight Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe. The card read, "Give this man what he wants." He recruited his psychological warfare unit from all the Allied forces, getting the skills that he wanted in it. And he took that psychological warfare unit into France as soon as the breakout occurred from the Normandy beachhead. His unit liberated towns from Normandy to Bordeaux who had never seen an Allied uniform till that time. And he was there to restore local government to its powers and duties and to restore communications, both news and radio, which had been stifled by the occupation up until that time. Well, you can imagine the celebrations that took place in these towns all the way down to Bordeaux.
Well, there could be a whole another night all about his war experiences. But now if we come back to Dallas.
Oh, well, and then afterwards when he hosted committee meetings in our home on Vassar Drive of OSS people who were planning the change from the OSS, which became the CIA. So he was in on that kind of stuff. He helped.
And tell us a little bit about your father's or your mom, Florence.
She was
well, that's Aunt Adele right there. That's Florence right there.
Yeah. She was a musician. She was an artist as well, but she preferred to develop her music more than her artistic skills, graphic arts. She was a soprano. Went to SMU, where she studied first piano and then voice. They met and were married in 1923. She really wanted to be an opera singer, but she didn't quite have that kind of voice, but she did sing on WBAP radio. And well, anyway, she was a very smart, very talented woman, a wonderful mother. Like I say, both parents were our role models, and we loved them dearly.
What about the airport that your dad bought for your mom?
Oh, well, it's like mother, her friends were artists and musicians. Dad's friends were people who were important in the business community, like members of the Salesmanship Club or the Dallas Citizens Council or golfers, because he was an avid golfer. He played golf, and he was members of the Dallas Country Club, Brook Hollow, Lakewood, all of them. Well,
and then he decided she needed to be entertained a little bit, so he bought her an airport.
That's right. So what? It's like their friends. I mean, she didn't like his friends. He didn't like her friends, and they grew quickly apart, leading separate lives, so to speak. But anyway, Dad was generous, such a generous person, and so thoughtful. He bought Clearview Airport in Oak Cliff as a real estate investment, but also to give my mother some new interests, new things to do. So she got a commercial pilot's license and managed Clearview Airport. Well, during the time that she was managing Clearview, I turned 16. And at 16, I learned to drive a car. I learned to drive a tractor and mow the grass on the airfield. And I learned to fly a Piper Cub and put 35 solo hours in my logbook. Well, anyhow, Mother and Dad divorced in 1947. And Dad, in his generosity, and he didn't have a mean bone in his body. He was a wonderful man. He sent his divorced wife, daughter and son on a cruise after the divorce we went to Brazil and Argentina. And then again, in his generosity, he sent me to Andover and to Yale. And upon graduation from Yale, he offered me the choice of graduate school or a trip to Europe. So, of course, I chose the latter and traveled for 14 months. 3 months of it in a training course at the Ballet Shoe headquarters in Schönenberg, Switzerland. Fascinating time. I learned a lot about the shoe business and all of the complexities that are involved in it. But anyway, that's a story by itself.
And then he remarried to Dorothy.
He remarried Dorothy Hill from Port Arthur, Texas, who was a graduate of Texas Woman's University, and they were very happily married. They thoroughly enjoyed all of Dad's friends, as my mother had not, and Dorothy shared his commitment to community service and was very much involved in Dallas organizations like the Girl Scouts and Northwood Institute, and I don't know what all else,
And then,
but they were happily married.
and
They had a daughter who died very, very young, and then a second daughter, Virginia Ginger Heidman, who lives with her husband in the near Wimberley in the hill country. And they are both artists.
yes. And then tell us about your dad's community service.
Well, this was one of the things that made him a hero in my mind, was his dedication to community service. He was one of the Dallas business leaders who, because of their privileged position in the community, were able to do this kind of work. So I have kind of a list of some of these things that I'll tell you about. Okay. For example, he was the founder and the first president of the Community Chest Trust Fund that later became the huge Communities Foundation of Texas. He was the president of the Dallas Central Business District Association. He was a director, a member, or an advisor of a whole string of major organizations, including the Dallas Citizens Council, the Dallas Chamber of Commerce, Dallas Crime Commission, Dallas Art Association, Dallas Symphony Orchestra Association, Dallas Council on World Affairs, Greater Dallas Planning Council, Dallas Civic Opera, Salesmanship Club, St. Mark's School. And he was a supporter and contributor to many community assets like St. Mark's, Hockaday, Northwood Institute, and SMU. But like I say, he was to me, he was an inspiration and a role model.
And he was such an inspiration that you went on and did about 35 years of community service in our city. So tell us a little bit about your role in community service in Dallas. Maybe a little bit about goals for Dallas.
Well, my architectural career and my volunteer career were concurrent for 35 years in Dallas. And some of my architectural design is in a notebook out front. And my volunteer career, I'll just tell you about two or three examples of it. For 12 years, I was one of the key volunteers in the Goals for Dallas program. At the first Salado conference in June of '66, there were 200 conferees representative of all of Dallas community who were divided into 3 discussion groups to talk about goals. There were 3 people who drafted goals. I was one of the 3. I was at this time about a 36 or 7-year-old apprentice architect, hadn't even passed the exams to call myself an architect. But I was charged with writing the goals for 4 of the 12 goal areas, including design of the city, transportation, cultural affairs, and housing. And I remember the pressure to get things done. Well, the three goal writers received copious notes of the discussions of the three groups. I have vivid memories that all the notes that I received from those three contained problems, concerns, opinions, and not a single goal statement. So the three of us goal writers had major challenge to imaginations and and hard work. Well, at the end of it, we submitted our draft goals to the three groups of conferees and were surprised, gratified, and pleased because all three of them said, "That's exactly what we meant." What a relief. Well, anyhow, later on, I led several of the community meetings to discuss the proposed goals and improve them, add to them and improve them. I was one of the conferees at a second goals conference to put the comments plus the originals into final form. I was on the design of the city task force on implementation, charged with devising agencies and steps needed in order to accomplish each one of the goals. I wrote the report for the design of the city's task force. Like I say, I was active as a volunteer in Goals for Dallas for 12 years. I would really it would be a really worthwhile program for me to give my eulogy to Mayor Eric Johnson for creating that program that meant so much to our community. But that's not for tonight.
Next time at Dallas Historical Society.
And I'll also tell you of some other volunteer stuff that I did, and that was I organized and led a community design center. Some examples of the kinds of things that we did. We organized the West Dallas community and helped them get, let's say, I should add that the West Dallas community was poor and ignored by City Hall, basically. They didn't get anything out of bond programs and well, we helped them get in the 72 bond program $2 million in changes made that were helpful to the West Dallas community. Plus, an incredible feat, bond money, unassigned, which the West Dallas community could decide how to use. Well, my little organization with a West Dallas Neighborhood Design Committee conducted a year of hearings of West Dallas people to decide what they wanted to do with that money. Well, it wound up creating 9 small parks all through West Dallas and improving them. It was supposed to create 24 bus stop shelters, but the city carried out the park part, but reneged on the bus stop shelters because that's when DART was being formed and the city was getting out of public transportation. So they ignored that part. The West Dallas Committee continued to speak for West Dallas interests for years after that. I also worked on affordable housing. I wrote a long paper on affordable housing in Dallas. What it is, how we got it, what the problems are, what the solutions are, who the players are. And that became the AIA's policy on housing, with copies of my paper sent to everybody in sight who was a decision maker about housing. And the national AIA made our affordable housing committee's work their best chapter project nationally, and sent my paper to many other chapters around the country for their use.
You ready for your favorite part?
What?
You ready for your favorite part?
Oh, okay.
Your photography.
Oh, photography. Okay, well, let me tell you how it began. Remember, I said that I traveled for 14 months in Europe? Well, I became an enthusiastic photographer on January 3rd of 1950 in Limburg, Germany, when I bought a Leica 3C camera. Same newer version of my role model's Leica camera that he had bought years before. Well, anyway, and the reason that I became an enthusiast was not make a book or sell anything. It was part of enjoying life. It was a matter of not wanting to forget the neat stuff that I was finding in traveling in Europe. Great stuff. Well, that continued for 64 years of personal photography, and that became the well, I wasn't thinking of a book at all. I didn't think of making a book out of it until about 2006. And when I wrote the essays in the book every day, they were conclusions that I had reached from my years of architectural design, plus all these years of personal photography. And as I was writing the essays, I began to realize that this was not about my conclusions. This was really an open letter to all photographers, a challenge to say, each one of you, even if you are a professional at it, make your own personal collection of subject matter that you care strongly about, that nobody else would know to photograph and nobody else would take your way. And you will be gratified because other people will care about it too. So that kind of leads me to my message, which is that art, like flying, is freedom. And we are all artists if we allow ourselves that freedom.
Well, and that is in your book, which is available for sale after this little thing. But in the meantime, if anybody has any questions you'd like to ask my father, or if you want to share any of your memories about the Volk stores or anything like that, are you ready for that, Dad?
Sure.
I see a hand.
I'll be happy to answer if I can.
You can pick people, Dad.
Okay.
Pick her.
Please.
He picked me.
He picked you.
How did your father feel about you wanting to be an architect instead of running the store?
He always wanted me to succeed him as president of Volk Brothers, and take his place. Unfortunately, I was not the right person to do that. I did not have his skills. I had a different set, and architecture proved the right thing for me. But he was not. He was so gracious. He was not bitter about it. As much as he wanted me to succeed him, he supported me in what I was committed to do. He encouraged me in the volunteerism as well. Even though I was not heading up great big community organizations and stuff, the kind of things that he did. But he was generous. Yes.
Leonard, first of all, this has been extraordinary. I enjoyed every minute of it. I got to Dallas in 1969, and goals for Dallas was a huge deal at that time. And it was just everybody in the downtown business community was talking about it, so it was really neat to hear your story. My question is this: if you were on the drafting committee for goals for Dallas today, is there one goal that you would like to see that would enrich this city for the future?
Oh. No.
That's good.
Well,
Here we go.
Well, that's a fair question, a very good question, but I'm really not able to answer it because that was a long time ago, and I can't remember what's in the big book anymore. But I will say this, that I have recently written a whole list of changes in our city, which came directly from things that I learned in my 35-year volunteer career, and things that we need to change. But it's like it's very difficult to do things like that because decision makers who have spent a lot of time and energy getting to be decision makers don't want to hear it.
And next question. Yes, you.
Yes. Where was the Terrell Prep School located, and where was the airport in Oak Cliff located?
Terrell Prep School was at Ross and Garrett, and doesn't exist anymore. It actually joined with Texas Country Day to make St. Mark's, to be St. Mark's. Now, what was the rest of it?
Where was the airport in Oak Cliff?
Oh gosh, I think it was.
Is it Redbird Airport now, or
You're talking about Clearview, the one that Dad bought. I think it was on Hampton Road in Oak Cliff. Yeah.
Yes.
Which was the last of the stores to close, and when was that?
Oh, God.
Which was the last of the stores to close, and when was that?
Oh, well, all of the stores were sold to Colbert in 1970.
And then they became
It's like
Colbert Volks.
what?
They became Colbert Volks.
Well, they called it Colbert Volk, yeah, but it didn't have anything to do with Volk because, for example, the grand, generous first floor of Volk Brothers, which was so welcoming and so gracious and everything, the first thing they did was to take out all of the fixtures, build a platform for plain pipe racks of sale clothes. You know, they had no concept they were not real merchants. Not really.
It was a fake store. Yes?
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there are two Dallas establishments that have been around as long as you have. The Dallas Country Club and the Adolphus Hotel. How many times you talk about the Dallas Country Club? Tell us about the Adolphus and any experiences you've had there.
So, Daddy,
I can't quite.
I can. Okay. He said that there's two establishments that have been around as long as like you have, or maybe Volk Brothers had. And it was Dallas Country Club and the Adolphus. And you shared a little bit about Dallas Country Club. So do you have any memories of the Adolphus as a child or growing up in Dallas?
Well, no, not really, but I'll say this, that I have a whole collection of downtown Dallas in details, which contains about 20 photographs of the exterior of the Adolphus Hotel, because that building has got architectural details and sculpture on it, which is perfectly beautiful. And the thing is that when we walk along our downtown sidewalks, we're usually thinking about what happened last week or where we're going. And we're not really aware of our surroundings. And that building is beautiful, the exterior. And I am pleased to have been able to take details of it.
Which are also in the book, which is available for sale after tonight's talk.
Well, no, actually, the series is not, because it was later than the.
There's pictures of the Adolphus in the
Well,
book.
what?
There's a picture of the Adolphus in the book.
Maybe one or two at most.
Yes, Leonard? That's Leonard too, by the way.
I know
Leonard.
you spoke about the criticism your father took for opening suburban stores
Oh, yeah,
and how they believed he was going to damage his downtown business.
right.
You know, I've been in Dallas 72 years, and I've seen complete dissolution of the downtown central business district in terms of marketing and department stores and shopping.
Yeah.
Looking back, do you see any connection to the escape from downtown Dallas to the suburbs with that movement that started in 1935?
Well, I think it's part of the rapid and extensive growth. It's where the people are. So the retailing followed the people, instead of expecting them to make a difficult commute to downtown in order to shop. So I think that this is part of the Metroplex growth. Directly responsible for it.
Yes.
My question is about Volk Estates and the architect Hal Thompson the architect of your grandfather's house?
So in Volk Estates, it was Gail Thompson, right?
Hal Thompson built, the great Dallas architect Hal Thompson built several houses in Volk Estates. And I just wondered if you as an architect know anything about how he came to be commissioned to build so many of those houses?
The architect that designed your parents' house on Vassar.
Oh, that was I. Gaydon Thompson.
And did he design other houses in Volk Estates?
I don't know.
Oh, you don't know?
I don't know.
He doesn't know.
I'm sorry, I can't answer that one.
One more try. Anyone?
But it's like, did I mention that O'Neill Ford had? I think I told you that before. Had made a design. I never saw the plans for it. I wish they had them, and I had been able to look at them when I became an architect. But I never saw them.
All right. Well, we have a reception in the lobby area with wine and his book, which is for sale. And and then a lot of other really cool things you can thumb through. He's got a notebook he made of some of his architectural designs throughout his career. And there's a notebook for a lot of the Volk Brothers photos and a lot of the telegraphs, which are really cool, or telegrams rather.
In my architectural notebook out there, the very first item, if you open it up, is Volk duplex on Edgewater, which was, let's say, where the norm for duplexes is side by side or over and under. What I did was I built a duplex of 2 independent townhouses, which were made a single structure as required by our ordinances, by connecting them with the roof of a carport that was shared by the 2. So each of the little townhouses had its private fenced garden and was completely separate. And all we shared was the roof of the carport, and it was roofed incidentally. That was an amenity. It wasn't a problem, even though it was a gravel surface, because there was an arbor on the walk approach to the rear unit, which supported cables all the way across from the arbor to the carport for a wisteria arbor. So we had a shady green roof over the carport, and it was an attractive amenity. And it's like from the rear unit, our bedroom looked out over a green wisteria lawn that was purple in the spring.
Very beautiful. Okay, Dad, it's time to go look at that book
Okay.
and drink some wine. Thank you, everybody, for being
Thank
here.
you.